So thank you again for joining. Tonight's session is titled The Lavender Scare, the Cold War Persecution of Gays and Lesbians. David Johnson is our lead scholar, but I'm also pleased to welcome Jennifer Connolly. Jennifer is a current Teacher Advisory Council member and our TA for the night. So Jennifer has created resources that are in the webinar folder, and she'll be dropping those links in the chat box. She's also here to ask questions, to pose thoughts about the instructional piece that would be a companion to this particular webinar. So Professor Johnson, thank you again for joining us. Go ahead and turn your mic on, and I'll welcome you to the stage and invite you to take over.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks to you and to Libby and to everybody at the National Humanities Center for hosting me. Thank you all for coming to learn about the Lavender Scare. National Humanities Center is a great institution, both creating scholarship like mine and helping us to disseminate it and get it out there, which is great. You may not know much about the Lavender Scare. Not many people do. It hasn't been taught unless you graduated this year from the California school system, which is now mandating coverage of LGBT people and has a program for teaching the Lavender Scare in the 11th grade. Other than that, right, you probably don't know a lot about it. So I want to start with something everybody does know about. Right?
Professor,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm getting a little bit of feedback in the audience chat that your voice is low right now. I wonder if there's a way to maybe move closer to the microphone or increase the volume on your end. You might just need to project a little bit. It looks like many of them can't quite hear you right now.
Okay, I will try to speak louder.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to start by talking about a story everybody is familiar with, Joseph McCarthy, right, and his rise to national prominence in the 1950s. It's probably a story you learned in high school. It's maybe one hopefully you teach if you teach about the Cold War and the McCarthy era. Senator McCarthy was a fairly obscure junior senator from Wisconsin until February 1950, when he made a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. Right, it was a Lincoln Day address. You can see the cutout of Lincoln's head there on the table. Right, the day when many Republican politicians go out and make speeches. Nothing particularly extraordinary about that. But when Senator McCarthy gave this speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, he said he held in his hand a list, right? A list of 205 card-carrying communists currently working in the State Department with the knowledge of the Secretary of State. That claim that there were communists in the State Department, that wasn't anything particularly new either. That claim had been made for quite some time. But what captured the media's attention and eventually the nation's attention was this claim to hold in his hand a list, right, to have evidence of this subversion in the State Department. And you see this a lot in certainly in the 50s and even since in American history, where claims of evidence make a difference. Think about Nixon and the Pumpkin Papers, right, holding up the film strip that supposedly had confidential documents on it. So it becomes this well-known moment in American history, but fewer people remember that those charges actually kept changing. First, they were 205 card-carrying communists, then they were 87 communists, then there were 57. So the number kept changing, and the designation kept changing as well. First, they were card-carrying communists, then they were loyalty risks, and then they were a more amorphous term, security risks. And I'll talk later on about the distinctions between those terms. But McCarthy's colleagues wanted specifics. They wanted to see the list. They wanted to know who was on this list. And 2 weeks later, Joseph McCarthy appears on the Senate floor, and he gives details about what at that point he's calling 81 loyalty risks. And most of those cases were people who belonged to communist organizations, were kind of fellow travelers in the terms of the 50s, people who read communist literature, and in a few cases, people who actually acted as Soviet agents. But there were two cases that stood out from all of the rest. They weren't about communists at all. They were about groups of homosexual State Department employees who had been fired as security risks. And each time McCarthy got to this particular group on the list or sets of groups, he told a story. He used them to actually help explain all of the other people on the list. He said, "You will find that practically every active communist is twisted mentally or physically in some way." And here you already see this kind of conflation between communists and homosexuals, the sense that both are the result of some sort of psychological disturbance. Right? The Truman administration responded by denying that there were any communists in the State Department, denying that there had ever been any communists in the State Department. But within a few weeks, the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who happened to be on Capitol Hill answering questions about the State Department budget, was questioned very aggressively by Joseph McCarthy's more senior Republican colleagues. And under very intense questioning, Dean Acheson admits that, well, the State Department did fire 202 people that it considered to be security risks, right? 202 of them. And then under even more intense questioning, it's finally his aide, John Perryfoy, pictured next to him here, who admits that, well, among those, there were 91 homosexuals. 91. So almost half of the people that had recently been fired by the State Department as security risks were homosexuals. And this seems to corroborate McCarthy's otherwise completely groundless and baseless charges. It sets off this, what I call this Lavender scare, this fear that gay people had infiltrated the government. People wanted to know who hired them, right, in the State Department. Where did they go? Did they go to other agencies? And how many homosexuals were in other agencies? So rather than being seen as an example of a good security system that got rid of these people, it actually sets off this Lavender scare, this desire to systematically remove gays and lesbians, not only from the State Department, but eventually from the entire federal government. So that's the moment when this happens. And mail pours in to Washington, to the White House, to Capitol Hill, and certainly to Senator McCarthy's office. Senator McCarthy supposedly got 25,000 letters, mostly in support of his campaign against the State Department. Those letters are actually still under seal at Marquette University. I've never seen them. But the journalists who looked at them in the 50s reported that only about a quarter of the letter writers were concerned about what they called red infiltration. But that 3/4 of the letter writers were indignant about the evidence of sex depravity that McCarthy had unleashed. So clearly it was the homosexual charges that were creating more of a stir. And even some of President Truman's top aides wrote him a memo that said quite explicitly that. They wrote him and they said, the country is more concerned about the charges of homosexuals in the government than about communists. So clearly McCarthy had sort of inflamed public concern, and he was being pushed by his more senior Republican colleagues to focus on the homosexual charges and kind of forget the communist charges. Those politicians realized that these seemed to be better targets. They were creating more of a stir, and there were more of them. Right? And by 1950, there were few, if any, communists left in the federal government, but there were lots of gay people. And if you wanted to tar the Democratic administration as the party of subversives, that this was the way to go. Right? It was the best way to essentially demonize the Truman and Roosevelt administrations and all of the New Deal Democrats who had come in to office in the previous 20 years. And you can see some of this in the kind of dual nature of McCarthy's attack. Sometimes he was very explicit, right? Sometimes he talked about attacks on communists and cocksuckers, but in print material, they were usually less explicit. You see, and this is actually a matchbook cover from the period, talking about supporting Joe McCarthy in his fight against two things, right? Almost always were two parts to his attack. In this case, they call it treason and dishonor, right? Treason obviously deals with issues of loyalty and communism, but dishonor, right? What is that? Well, that suggests it's about issues of morality. And in this case, given the context of the February 1950 revelation, it's clearly about homosexuality. Often newspaper accounts couldn't or chose not to use the specific language, sex pervert or homosexual. And often in the 1950s, the term security risk functioned essentially as a euphemism for homosexual. McCarthy, for reasons that are not entirely clear, did not actually follow the advice of his more senior colleagues. He did not focus on the homosexual charges. He went off and talked about for the next few years about alleged communists in the government, to not terribly good effect. We're not sure why. He was a single. He was unmarried when he became fairly famous. He very quickly married his secretary, so there's speculation about that. But the whole issue of homosexuals in government in the Lavender Scare quickly moves beyond McCarthy and becomes moves into the realm of public policy, as we'll see. In the summer of 1950, in response to all of this public concern and all of this mail, Congress actually held hearings on what it called the employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in the government. There were actually no other sex perverts. It just seemed to be a way to emphasize the sexual perversion almost as a modifier to the word homosexual. This is a cartoon about that decision to investigate the issue by Herblock, the famous cartoonist from the Washington Post who coined the term McCarthyism, a well-regarded cartoonist from the 1950s. Here he's sort of making fun of this decision, right, to investigate sexual perversion, calling it abnormal psychology, right, suggesting that it's the members of Congress, right, who are illustrating an abnormal psychology rather than the people they're investigating. But that hearing in the summer of 1950 is chaired by Clyde Huey from North Carolina. He's a Democrat. Democrats were in control of the Senate at this point, which shows how this quickly became a kind of bipartisan issue, even though it begins as a Republican attack. The Truman administration and the Democrats certainly were not in the position to defend homosexuals. In fact, there was really no one in the public at the time who defended the employment of gay people in the federal government. In this picture, next to Senator Huey is Margaret Chase Smith, right, the Republican senator from Maine who famously came out against Joseph McCarthy. But she was part of the hearings about the employment of homosexuals and thought that was a perfectly good thing to do, right, to ferret them out of the federal government. An example how this becomes kind of a bipartisan issue and part of standard government procedure. The committee that summer, in their hearings, called a bunch of witnesses. They called in military intelligence experts. They called in law enforcement. They called in the head of the vice police in D.C. They called in the head of the CIA, which was then a fairly new organization. And all of these experts testified that, yes, gay men and lesbians were vulnerable to blackmail, and therefore, yes, of course, they were threats to national security, and yes, of course, we need to get them out of the government. And in the report that the committee published at the end of the year, they repeated that claim. They said that, quote, the lack of emotional stability which is found in most sex perverts and the weakness of their moral fiber makes them susceptible to the blandishments of the foreign agent. And I often use this report or an edited version of it to show my students as a primary source. It's not too long. It's publicly available on the internet. And ask them about this claim, right? Does this make sense? And at first, they seem to think, yeah, they're vulnerable to blackmail. Sure, gay people were a threat to national security. But then I also asked them, well, what evidence is there for this? And the man who was in charge of the committee hearings, Francis Flanagan, who was the chief counsel to the committee, he too asked the experts who testified this. He always wanted, as a good attorney, he wanted some evidence for this claim. And the only thing they could come up with there we go. The only piece of evidence that these experts were able to offer was this guy, Colonel Alfred Radel, who was in fact a gay man. He was a double agent. He's probably one of the most famous double agents in the history of espionage. He was head of Austrian intelligence in the run-up to World War I, and he was also working with the Russians at the time. But this is the only piece of evidence they could find of a human being, not an American citizen, obviously, who had betrayed state secrets, supposedly under threat of blackmail. When the head of the CIA testified about him, he actually created a story that apparently is not true. He said that the Russians had blackmailed him and caught him in flagrante delicto and therefore blackmailed him. In fact, it turns out that Alfred Radel he just wanted the money, and so he was working with the Russians. But anyway, I often ask my students about this. What would you think if this was the one piece of evidence that the committee had? Does that justify this blanket exclusion? What do you think if a group, just any group, Group X, is considered a threat to national security based on the activities of one of its members for something that person did 35 years ago, because this was 35 years before 1950, and did it in another country, not an American citizen? Does that justify this policy? And then it looks a little different, right, to them. And also, it's an opportunity to ask them, what groups are currently considered threats to national security, and what evidence do we have for that, and how should they be treated? So, given this lack of real concrete evidence that gay people posed a threat to national security, we have to ask ourselves, what were the real motivations behind this Lavender scare, right? What else is going on in American culture that would make gays and lesbians good scapegoats? Right? And I already suggested that part of it was about partisan political activity, that it was a tool of the Republicans to win votes. But there were some other things that I think are important to think about going on in American history in the post-war period. Of course, after World War II, there's lots of fears in American culture, right? Despite the kind of return to normalcy and return to prosperity. Obviously, there's the beginning of the Cold War tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, so there's lots of fear of communism. That's fairly obvious. Fears of nuclear annihilation. Right? You have students engaging in duck and cover exercises under their classroom chairs. Because the United States is engaged in a Cold War against what's termed atheistic communism, which already has a kind of moral tone to it. But there's another fear in American culture after the war. This fear that America was in a state of moral decline. Right? The sense that things had gotten out of control during the war, sexual norms had gotten out of control, that oftentimes it was blamed on women, right? Blamed on victory girls who were women who thought it was their patriotic duty, right, to support the troops in any way they could, right, including sexually, and that literally American morality had gotten out of hand during the war. People also pointed to all the family disruptions created by the war. Millions of men drafted, right, taken out of their small towns, given unprecedented freedom in American port cities, right, discovering all kinds of vices. And often those men taken out of their small towns were put into same-sex environments where they could discover all kinds of things they might not have found in their small town. Right? This is a Canon towel ad from the 1940s demonstrating a very homoerotic atmosphere in the Pacific among the American troops. Right? It looks really like kind of like an Abercrombie and Fitch ad more than anything else. So there was this sense, and fear really, that American sexual standards were loosening, that the gay subculture was becoming more visible and more lively. And in 1947, there was an obscure entomologist from Indiana University who seemed to corroborate these fears about changing American sexual standards. Alfred Kinsey, of course, in 1947 publishes The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, the most extensive survey of American sexual practices ever conducted, really, before or since. And this seemed to confirm this fear that American sexual behavior no longer conformed to Victorian morals. Right? Kinsey famously found very high rates of premarital sex, of extramarital sex, and most shockingly of all, very high rates of homosexual behavior. The Kinsey report suggested that 37% of American men had had at least one homosexual encounter. So this kind of atmosphere, this fear about declining American morality, leads to what some historians have called a post-war sex crime panic. This fear that sex criminals were threatening American families and American children. 15 states established commissions to actually study the problem. Some of them passed new laws, often called sexual psychopath laws. One popular magazine put the connection this way. It said, once a man assumes the role of homosexual, he often throws off all moral restraints. Some male sex deviants do not stop with infecting their often innocent partners. They descend through perversions to other forms of depravity, such as drug addiction, burglary, sadism, and even murder. This fear of the sex predator appears in popular culture in the 50s and well, actually starting in the 40s, right in the post-war period. Hollywood, in particular, sealed the connection between homosexuality and crime. We see it particularly in films like Alfred Hitchcock's Rope from 1948. Alfred Hitchcock, of course, was known for exploiting all kinds of fears, including fear of birds. But here, right, he's exploiting this fear of the homosexual sexual psychopath. But he couldn't film making a movie in 1948. The Hays Code is in force. Hitchcock couldn't actually say that these the men in his film were gay, but he makes hints about it. The main characters shown here, Philip and Brandon, they live together in a very fashionable New York apartment. Philip is known to be artistic, which was an old code word for homosexual. And in the opening scene, where the two lovers kill a third man, Philip and Brandon are shown together in a dark room, struggling, breathing heavily, and when their task is completed, they rest together in the dark, and Philip lights a cigarette. Warner Brothers' promotional poster for Rope touted it as the most excitement-filled love story ever told. So Alfred Hitchcock's Rope and a lot of other movies from the period suggested to millions of Americans that even middle-class homosexuals, believing themselves to be outside traditional moral constraints, could become criminal sexual psychopaths. We even see this fear in American, or in the American reaction to comics in the 1950s. Frederick Wertheim, in his book Seduction of the Innocent, warned Americans that comics were a bad influence on children. He was particularly concerned about their displays of the female body, their displays of what he considered sadomasochistic activity. And in the case of Batman and Robin, he was concerned that they glorified a kind of homosexual lifestyle with an older man and a younger man living together. Right. So you see a lot of this in American culture in the 1950s.
Professor, may I ask a question at this point? And I'm going to pull in a comment that our friend Lee Holder made earlier in reaction to this notion of what you termed real evidence. I'm curious about your role as a researcher here. I mean, you've got some really clear and very public examples, but what was it like as an historian to research a topic that is essentially invisible?
Well, it wasn't easy, particularly.
Yeah.
I'm remembering my first trip to the National Archives, going into the reading room, talking to an archivist who was specialized in State Department records, so diplomatic records, and was used to dealing with diplomatic historians. And here I say I'm interested in, the department's treatment of homosexual employees and its response to the McCarthy charges. And he was not interested in in that topic. Basically,
right.
Said, "Oh, you can't look at people's personnel records."
Right.
And was not helpful at all. I had to find another archivist who was more sympathetic, right, to my cause and do a lot of digging. Right? You can't just go in and look in the index under homosexual. So I had to look under State Department security records and things like that.
And how important was it to be able to? You've mentioned coded words several times. I'm sure there was a very large percentage of fans of Adam West and the early Batman, including Jeremy, who was shocked to hear the statement about that. But it's almost like a decoder ring. Once you kind of see it, it's hard not to see it. But right, I mean.
Yes, that's right. And you get to, if you read enough, newspapers of the period, right, and you see how they use the language, right, and how they certain newspapers were quite forthcoming about using the language sex perverts or whatever, and other ones were much more reticent.
But at the same time, it's not harmless coded language. It's not sort of cleverness, as Jennifer pointed out, our TA pointed out in the chat box a little bit earlier. This notion of sexual predator has long been used to justify the erosion of civil liberty.
Right. Good point. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. It's just, it's really intriguing, to imagine your work as an historian in the past, and then, I wonder if the context of today's contemporary perspective and worldview changes that work at all.
What do you mean by the contemporary?
Well, I mean, topics of gay and lesbian rights, as many of our teachers in the audience have put in the chat box. It's a conversation that's much easier to have in classrooms and curriculum. If historians work in context, then the context of 2020 with legal gay marriage and other kinds of things, does that change your approach to the same kind of work as an historian?
No, I haven't changed my approach. I mean, as I get, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, how that discourse gets changed by people affected, in fact, by the Lavender Scare, right?
Right.
So at this point in the 50s, right, the language is all about, it's about morality, it's about blackmail, it's about national security, it's about sexual psychopaths, but it changes, and that's part of the story,
right,
as well, as we'll see.
Great, thank you for sharing that.
Great. That was actually a good place to stop, because I was starting at sort of a new section. I talked about the sort of the cultural realm, Batman, and all of that. But of course, this also influences politics, right? And the fear of communism and the fear of declining morality come together in this perfect storm to create the Lavender Scare. And it's really in 1952, the 1952 presidential election, that we see this fear of homosexual infiltration actually being involved in presidential politics and helping win elections. So 1952, it's the first presidential election since the rise of Joseph McCarthy, right, in 1950 in the Lavender Scare. And of course, it's a contest between Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, who is governor of Illinois, and the Republican candidate Dwight David Eisenhower. Adlai Stevenson, Democratic candidate, is and was often derided as an intellectual egghead. One newspaper said he had a fruity voice. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, spread rumors that Adlai Stevenson had actually been arrested on a sex charge, that he was essentially one of these sex criminals. He was certainly a wealthy, urbane, former State Department official, right, at a time when anyone who worked for the State Department came under scrutiny. So he was, in many ways, the kind of man that many people thought should be removed from Washington, right, not sent to Washington. Most scandalous of all was the fact that Adlai Stevenson, Democratic candidate, was divorced His wife had divorced him just a couple of years ago, or previous, and there were rumors about the reason for that divorce. Confidential magazine, this tabloid magazine of the 50s, actually ran a story, right, about how that Stevenson rumor started without ever having to explain what the rumor was, because everybody knew what it was. People talked about it being about the reason for the divorce that impacted on the manliness of the candidate. And the Republicans in that campaign couldn't, of course, actually mention this explicitly, as we talked about before, but their campaign literature made a lot of hints about it. Their campaign slogan was "Let's Clean House," right, with Ike and Dick Nixon, which meant they wanted to get rid of, all of the New Dealers in Washington, the communists, certainly, the subversives, and was a broad enough term to include the homosexuals, right, that had been so much in the news in the previous 2 years. Their campaign literature, this is one of their campaign pamphlets, emphasized that they were regular guys, they were God-fearing men, and they were for morality. Right? Why did they need to say that? It suggests that their opponents were not for morality, right? That they were somehow for immorality. Most important of all, they appeared, well, they said they were family men, right? And they made regular appearances with their wives and with their children, right? Or at least the Nixons did. Nixon appeared with his wife, Pat Nixon, and their 2 young daughters, and the Eisenhowers brought out their grandchildren, right, to emphasize that they were family men, and to call attention to the fact that Adlai Stevenson was not a family man. He was divorced, and why was that? In fact, it's really 1952 that what we now take for granted, right? These campaign appearances. Oops, I skipped one slide. Campaign appearances with spouses, right? It's now kind of a staple. We don't even think about it in American politics. It's fairly unique, though, to American politics, right? The French don't do that. British don't really do that. Americans didn't really do it either until 1952 as a way to call attention to the fact that Adlai Stevenson was unmarried, was divorced. So there were even pins that were manufactured to tout how Mamie Eisenhower would become First Lady if you voted for Ike, and if you voted for Adlai Stevenson, well, there would be no First Lady. Right? There was a tremendous amount of attention given to the marriage between Mamie and Dwight Eisenhower. Even this Life cover story picture of them when they were newlyweds. Right? Why did that matter to the election? Well, it painted a contrast with the Democratic candidate. So I really argue that 1952 was the first time that family values become a major issue in American politics. And it helped win the election, the slogan, "Let's Clean House." Many Republican operatives thought not only did it help win votes in 1952, but it should continue to help them win elections. There was a debate once they get into office, the Republicans get into office, and Eisenhower wins, and they implement their policies, they begin to clean house on whether or not they should publicize it or not. And I found this amazing memo from one of these Republican operatives writing to the Secretary of State, where he says there is a considerable body of opinion in the Republican Party to the effect that it is not enough to clean up the mess in Washington, but also it is necessary that the administration expose the extent of this mess, making a record which will enable candidates of the Republican Party to seek re-election for many years to come. Right? In other words, they knew that this was a winning political strategy. Family values, right, in American politics and helping to win elections. So, as I said, of course, Eisenhower wins, becomes president in 1953, and begins to implement this promise to clean house, passes an executive order establishing a security system, which stipulates that a whole list of disqualifications for federal government employment, one of which is sexual perversion. So I want to stop here for a minute and kind of talk about the difference between a loyalty program that Truman had and the new security program that Eisenhower institutes. Because it's this moment in 1953 when essentially the Lavender Scare gets institutionalized in the federal government and becomes part of the sort of the standard operating procedure of the national security state. So what is the difference between loyalty and security? I don't know, do we have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that might be a good time to pause for a moment and let our audience contribute some thoughts. I appreciate their ongoing conversation in the audience chat box, but this will give you a chance to grab a sip of water, and let me flip this to the audience. What do you imagine? What do you see as the difference between these two terms, loyalty and security? And Professor, we're going to wait just a moment while they flex their fingers, find their keyboard. And you can view that, David, in the lower right. Christopher, of course, plays the ultimate teacher response, depends on the context. Nice job, Christopher. Of course, I'm kidding with you, but pick a context, Christopher. Tell us what you think how these two terms play against each other. Thank you, Caitlin. Loyalty is earned, security is demanded. What other thoughts does our audience have?
Well, the context is the Federal Civil Service, right? You have a program to make sure that either that your federal employees are loyal in one case, or that they're not a threat to national security in the new Eisenhower version.
Right. Thank you, Sharada. Loyalty is support and or allegiance, but security is safety from oppression or danger. Brandy offers loyalty can be blind, security is felt. Abel, I got your email, by the way, thank you. Faithful versus secure. Lori, loyalty can threaten security. Our present government is doing this right now. Sonia, loyalty is being able to trust someone. June, loyalty is dangerous because it requires us to ignore things that I almost thought that she wrote thugs, which would have been interesting, that might lead to a national security breach. Security means when we stand up when we are confronted by danger. Thank you. Great ideas, folks. Thomas, loyalty is because you want security, is because they offer that to you. Yeah, nice thought, Jeremy. A lot of good thoughts coming in. Thank you, David.
Yeah, so some of you, when you talk about loyalty, you talk about what did they say, a feeling or for security officials, loyalty was about a current state of mind, whether you were loyal or disloyal to the federal government, a desire or lack of desire to betray secrets, whether you were part of an organization that wanted to overthrow the federal government, right? So, are you a member of a communist or communist-affiliated organization, right? Do you read communist literature? Would be a question under a loyalty examination, right? Do you read the Daily Worker, right? Do you read other communist literature? Do you listen to Paul Robeson music, right? 'Cause Paul Robeson was considered a leftist or fellow traveler, or actually, I guess actually a party member. But anyway, all right. So it was about a current state of mind, an actual current desire to overthrow the government. Security, on the other hand, has a different emphasis. It's not about a current state of mind. It's about more amorphous issues like character, like suitability, like trustworthiness, or most famously, vulnerability to blackmail. So it's not about a current state of mind, current desire to overthrow the government, but the fact that you might in the future be, either because of carelessness or because of coercion, betray government secrets. So you haven't actually done anything subversive, but you might in the future. So it's a really broad kind of umbrella. It's really about what they called character. And there were three major types of people that were considered security risks under this Eisenhower security program. Alcoholics, right? People who drank too much. People who talked too much, the loquacious. And homosexuals, right? People who were vulnerable to blackmail because of their sexuality. Those are the three major categories: drinkers, talkers, and homosexuals. But we know of almost no examples of drinkers or talkers who were fired from the federal government as security risks, but all kinds of thousands, really, of people excluded because of their sexual orientation. It's estimated that about 1 in 5 Americans during the 50s and early 60s were subject to some sort of security investigation, either because they worked for the federal government, they were a federal government contractor, or their company had relationships with the federal government. And 1 out of 5 Americans. Now I want to tell you about what a security investigation would have been like. These interrogations, particularly about people's sex lives. I'm going to give you examples of 3 individuals who were subject to this kind of security investigation under the Eisenhower administration. Every civil servant and more, the people beyond the civil service, were subject to. And I will say in this section, there aren't. Well, I managed to create some pictures for us for it, but there aren't a lot of visual images. Neither of these people, and certainly not of these events, right? Whereas interrogations of suspected communists, oftentimes, where it happened on Capitol Hill, happened before the cameras, under the Klieg lights, before Joseph McCarthy's committee or others. These interrogations happened behind closed doors, in small rooms throughout Washington, and so there certainly aren't any visual images of it, and actually not too many records of them of any kind. If you would like more of this, and actually I had to borrow some of these images from the film The Lavender Scare, which was based on my book, which I highly recommend to you. It's not available streaming, but you could get, it's available for purchase, particularly by libraries. So I recommend you try to get your library to get a hold of a copy. It really kind of humanizes the story and tells these stories really well. So the first person I want to talk to about is Madeleine Tress, who's pictured here. She was a 25-year-old white woman who in 1958 was beginning a very promising career at the Department of Commerce. She had stellar credentials. She had a BA from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. She had an MA in economics from NYU, and she even spent a year at the London School of Economics. And she remembers the day in the spring of 1958. She remembers it was already hot in Washington. She remembers that she was wearing a pale blue suit and high heels. She was at her office desk, and two FBI investigators came to her, showed them their badges, and took her to their offices for an interrogation. They asked Tress to take an oath, which she did. She asked if she could have an attorney present during the interrogation, and the investigators said that she could not. So she began to answer kind of mundane questions, her name, her address, her date of birth. And then they asked her the question that changed her life. They said, "Miss Tress, the commission has information that you are an admitted homosexual. What comment do you wish to make regarding this matter?" Tress, as you can imagine, froze at this question because she wasn't sure which would be worse. She had two choices, right? She could admit to being gay, then she would be fired, or she could lie about it. Ultimately, she could be fired, right, for lying to the FBI. So Tress, like lots of people under this kind of interrogation, said she had no comment and refused to discuss the matter. But the investigators, of course, had other questions for her. They had already conducted a full field investigation of her. They had interviewed her friends, her neighbors, former professors, co-workers. So they asked her, "Were you ever at the Redskins Lounge?" which was a well-known lesbian bar in Washington, D.C. And Madeline Tress, thinking there was nothing illegal about it, admitted that she had been to the lesbian bar, that she enjoyed the music there. The officials, however, insisted that she went there to make homosexual contact. And that really was, that was considered a piece of evidence that you were gay, that you had gone to a gay bar. But they had other questions for her, right? They wanted to know, they said, "Do you know Kate Johnson? Do you know Doug Smith?" They named a host of her gay and lesbian friends. And again, she thought, well, there's nothing illegal, right, in knowing these people. So she admitted knowing what the officials considered to be known homosexuals, which was the second piece of damning evidence against her, right? Just knowing other gay people and socializing with them made her suspicious. The investigators, after that, actually got fairly specific and graphic. They wanted to know about specific sexual acts that she had committed. One of them said, "How do you like having sex with women?" The other one asked her, "You've never had it good until you've gotten it from a man." And Tress, like lots of people under this kind of very intense interrogation, admitted to some homosexual activity in her youth and claimed that she had broken away from it more recently. But as you can see, there's very little evidence that they had. They did coerce a little bit out of her, but not much. One of the other pieces of evidence that they got from confidential informants was that Mess was considered to be not at all feminine, right? She looked mannish, and that she wore severely tailored suits, right? That's the kind of level of evidence that security officials used, right, to make their claims. Tress considered this interrogation the most demeaning experience of her life. She compared it to what she imagined happened in Nazi Germany 15 years before, and she knew that the only option she had was resigning. She submitted her resignation the next day. She was one of the many people, thousands of people, I estimate probably between 5,000 and 10,000 who lost their jobs. Often, like Madeleine Truss, they officially resigned voluntarily, but it was really anything but voluntary. The other person I want to tell you about is Andrew Ferencz. His interrogation ended somewhat differently than Madeleine Truss's did. He worked for the State Department. He worked in the U.S. Embassy in Paris. It was kind of his dream job to get into the Foreign Service. Andrew had served in World War II. He'd studied lots of languages, and he found himself this great job in Paris at the American Embassy. He developed a relationship with another man who worked in the State Department. They shared an apartment in Paris. But the State Department, we're not quite sure how, but discovered and suspected his homosexuality, interrogated him about it at great length, including his relationship with his roommate. And soon after the interrogation, Andrew Ferencz returned to his apartment in Paris, turned on the gas stove, and committed suicide. We don't know how many people who were subject to this kind of interrogation did commit suicide. I know of a handful of cases. This is the one that's perhaps best documented. And one of the reasons it's documented in the records of the National Archives is because the federal government lied about it. They covered it up. It's not bad enough that the suicide actually happened, but then the government, realizing it was kind of implicated in the suicide, made up a story to tell the family that Andrew Ferencz was despondent over some non-existent health issue. So they created a cover story. And third story I want to tell you about a person who was subject to this kind of interrogation was Frank Kameny. And his interrogation also ended differently. He did not just resign voluntarily like Madeleine Truss. He did not commit suicide like Andrew Ferencz. Frank Kameny was an astronomer. He had a PhD from Harvard. He worked for the Army Map Service in 1957. He was helping the Army Map Service create maps of the entire globe, particularly, of course, countries like the Soviet Union, so that when the U.S. Army, if it ever lobbed an ICBM towards the Soviet Union, it would hit the proper target. Frank Kameny was working for the Army Map Service as an astronomer in 1957, right at the beginning of the space race, right just after the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik. The United States was behind in the space race. The United States needed scientists, right? And Frank Kameny was an astronomer with a Harvard PhD. But he was also gay, and they found that out. They found it out because of an arrest record in a known gay cruising area. And so he went through the same sort of interrogation, right? We have information that you are homosexual. What comment do you care to make? Frank didn't have any comment to make because they wouldn't tell him what the evidence was. He was a nerdy scientist. He didn't understand why the government was interested in his sex life. He thought it was ridiculous. He didn't know about this whole history beginning with Joseph McCarthy in 1950. So he fought his dismissal. He thought it was kind of a mistake and it was going to be taken care of. And he fought it administratively. He wrote letters to his members of Congress. He wrote letters to the White House. Nothing helped. He filed suit in court, making the claim that this security system, which had made him lose his job, this really wasn't about national security. It really wasn't about morality. Right? He said this was about his civil rights. It was about his right to be treated as a first-class citizen. He was not being treated that way. He was being treated as a second-class citizen because of his sexual orientation. Right? And it's really Frank Kameny, in his legal challenge, who begins to change the discourse, along with some other people at the time, people like Donald Webster Corey, who's writing about this, who say this is a civil liberties issue. He got nowhere in court with that. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear his case. So he decides to become an activist. He decides to form a gay organization in Washington, the Mattachine Society of Washington. Mattachine was the term then used by other gay organizations. On the right is a picture of a Mattachino, this kind of court gesture figure from the Renaissance, who, because he wore a mask, was able to tell the truth. And that was just the term used for several of the gay organizations in the country. Frank forms the Mattachine Society of Washington, gets other people involved in the struggle, other civil servants, helps them lead court cases against the federal government. By 1965, as you see here, they're picketing in front of the White House, right, the first public picket for gay rights, claiming, as Frank did in his litigation, that this was a matter of civil rights, right, and not psychology or morality or national security. And by 1969, they're winning court cases. The court case that was perhaps most important was Norton v. Macy. Norton was one of these fired gay civil servants who Frank Kameny nourished and helped in his court challenge against Macy, who was the head of the Civil Service Commission. The picture on the left is of members of the Mattachine Society of Washington picketing in front of the Civil Service Commission, right, demanding to be treated fairly and an end to this discriminatory policy. 1969, a federal appeals court rules in their favor, or favor of Norton. They say to the Civil Service Commission, you cannot prove a connection between these people's off-duty lifestyle, their off-duty behavior, and their ability to perform their job. And so you can no longer just have a blanket policy excluding all gay people from the federal civil service. Right? This is in 1969. If you know anything about LGBT history, you know that 1969 is the date of the Stonewall riots in New York. It's often considered the beginning of the movement. It's the date that's celebrated June 1969 every year and all over the world in pride parades. But by 1969, groups like the Mattachine Society of Washington had already won a major legal victory and kind of put in place the rhetoric and the strategies, right, that would inform the movement, for the next 50 years or more. So yeah, 1969. And of course, the Civil Service Commission and the government in general kind of hemmed and hawed. They dragged their feet. They tried to get around the ruling. They didn't change their policy officially until 1975, when they stopped a blanket discrimination against gay people. But lots of government agencies, national security agencies like CIA and the NSA, continued to ferret out and remove gay men and lesbians up until the 1990s. It's not until the 90s, until the Clinton administration, when Clinton signs 2 executive orders making it illegal, essentially, for the federal government to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation in the civil service and also in the granting of security clearances. So it's really not until the 1990s that the policies established in the 1950s, the Lavender Scare, might finally come to an end. So there is a kind of happy ending to this story after years and years of activism and picketing and litigation. Right? But Frank Kameny is welcomed to the White House, inside the White House, right, under the Obama administration. He boasted that he was on a first-name basis with Barack Obama. Obama's Secretary of State, John Kerry, at the very end of the Obama administration, actually apologized for the State Department's treatment of gays and lesbians. Right? So there is a kind of a happy ending to this, demonstrating how this period of oppression and scapegoating actually helped bring a community together, right, to fight and to resist its oppression. And it also demonstrates what I like to call the Cold War origins of the gay rights movement. The Cold War was so generative of so much of American culture, and I would argue also in many ways of the gay rights movement. And I just have a couple more points to make before we can have more questions.
Great.
Kind of, I guess what I see as the lessons of the Lavender Scare. I think one of them is that it helps explain Cold War and the Cold War fears. It helps us understand how political fears and sexual fears intertwined during the Cold War. It actually paints a much more complete picture of what happened during the Cold War and the McCarthy period. This here is, of course, the Reverend Billy Graham, one of the most prominent public figures of the 1950s and 60s, right, who held crusades all over the country, filled stadiums all over the country, filled Madison Square Garden, was known as a kind of advisor to presidents. He praised Senator McCarthy for his efforts, and in doing so, he said McCarthy, thankfully, he said, exposed the pinks, the lavenders, and the reds. Right? The pinks, the lavenders, and the reds. Which is true. That is what McCarthy did, and that's the full story of what McCarthy did. And if people are only teaching about the pinks and the reds, they're not telling the whole story. They don't explain this statement, right, by Billy Graham makes no sense if you're only talking about the pinks and the reds, and not the lavenders. I should say something here because I know someone's going to ask about this. Why lavender, right? Well, red, of course, was the color associated with communism. Pink was associated with fellow travelers, socialists, sort of a lesser version of a communist. And lavender was the color associated with homosexuals in the 50s. We're not entirely sure why. It seems to be because it's a blending of blue and pink. So it's a blending of sort of male and female colors, boy-girl colors. Or maybe it was just because it was flamboyant. We're not sure. But it was definitely the color associated with homosexuality at the period. So I think it's an important part of the story, and it helps give a fuller explanation of the fears of the Cold War, and make sense of Billy Graham's statement. The other lesson the Lavender Scare, or teaching about the Lavender Scare, provides, I think, is that it gives us a kind of tool, and we've already kind of touched on this, a tool for understanding the struggle between competing values, right? A value for freedom and a value for security, right? Something the United States is continually struggling with, right? We've seen it throughout American history, where certain groups are considered threats to America and need to be controlled or removed or somehow suppressed. And sometimes it's because of skin color, and sometimes it's because of national origin or religion, or in this case, sexuality. So I think it's an important way in which we can ask students to talk about, what groups are considered threats to national security, and is that real or is that imagined, and what evidence is there for that? Ask students what they see as similarities between, what's happening today and what happened during the Cold War. What happened during the Cold War, say, or in the war on terrorism, and ask them, right, how would they resolve this tension between the desire for security and the desire for freedom? How would they do it? And with that, I'd like to hear more from.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. We do have some questions that have come in, and I will encourage all of our audience to add any questions you'd like to be brought to the conversation in the Ask Professor Johnson tab, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Here's the first question, Professor. This comes from Eugenia, who is a graduate student at Vanderbilt University. And first of all, she notes that all the stories, the vignettes you shared, are heartbreaking, and she really appreciates having these case studies. She'd like to know, in your opinion, though, what would be the steps to depathologizing homosexuality in our communities? For example, how can we engage in discussions with people from other generations, let's say people who lived through the 50s and 60s and reified this ideology of oppression towards LGBTQ communities, to come to an understanding of diverse identities? What's the best way to approach this?
To depathologize. Well, I mean, it gets back to the first part of her question or comment, right? It's to tell these stories.
Yeah.
Right. Tell the stories of these individuals. And they are heartbreaking stories. People who were in no way a threat to national security. In fact, whose true desire, right, was in fact to serve their country, and or to serve the agency they worked for, and who did, and did, in a great way, until they were, forced out. So yeah, the stories.
These three stories, case studies, were particularly effective, including, one that ends in tragedy and one that ends with a certain amount of sort of success at the end. Of the three, which do you, when you share them with your students in university level, which one of them seems to resonate the most?
Well, I mean, it's probably the Frank Kameny story, right? Because he's kind of the hero, and he changes the discourse. He makes it more, it gives it a more modern valiance, right? People have trouble understanding how people consider this a pathology or a moral issue or a matter of national security. But Frank brings it into the kind of the modern era. Because this is about civil rights.
And while it's not that long ago, it certainly does feel to be in some cases. Next question is from Patrick. He's curious how questions of privacy figure in the archives during the post-war and post-Stonewall periods. Is it a thing that is being negotiated? Questions of privacy in the archives?
Oh, privacy. Well, depends on which archives we're talking about, I guess. In the National Archives, yeah, there are issues of privacy, records that are still considered classified or unavailable, right, for privacy issues. I happen to be lucky enough that the records of the Hui Committee in 1950 they were under a kind of a time limit. They had just been opened up when I started my research. It was just 50 years since they had been put into the National Archives. So I was lucky that I was, I think, the first person who was able to see them. I'm not sure if it's in LGBT archives or community-based archives. Less of an issue if people have given their papers, for example. As Madeline Trust did, Madeline Trust got her own FBI file through the Freedom of Information Act. Right? Thank you, Lyndon Johnson, part of the Great Society. It's a very powerful tool, Freedom of Information Act. She got her own FBI file and in her papers. They're at the San Francisco Public Library. Thanks.
Unfortunately, Professor, we are out of time and need to conclude tonight's session. But I do want to thank you for leading the conversation and sharing with us your expertise and the work you did with us at the center. We look forward to continued work in this field and very much appreciate your efforts in bringing these resources to our audience. Thank you, David.